you've been producing the UK and Changing Europe Divergence Tracker, tracking divergence. So you're started for 10. How far has the UK diverged from the European Union since Brexit?
Well, the very short answer is not very. I think kind of the key takeaways from the work that we've been doing tracking this hunt for Brexit opportunities, ways to change EU regulation now we're outside the EU, is that there's been a lot of heat from government, but relatively little light. So there's been big plans to review where we might be able to change EU regulation. For example, there was a 108-page document called The Benefits of Brexit, which came out in 2022, listing kind of myriad ways we could change everything from financial services to state aid to procurement to gene editing, lots of different things. And we've tracked all that stuff, but relatively little of it has actually kind of come to fruition and fundamentally changed how we do things in the UK. And, very similar to the way it did when we left the EU. I think the key question is why, obviously. And I think the truth is that there are quite a few practical barriers to changing regulation. And the two most important are, one, that businesses like predictability, and two, that the EU is a really important market for the UK still. So to address that first point, for example, you might have good reason to want to change your regulation on, say, medical devices because the EU's way of approving it is more cumbersome than would be ideal. And now outside the EU, we could do that. We could make a nimbler, more effective system. But the problem is, if you're an international business and you want to sell that device into the UK and the EU, and they have separate regulatory regimes, that's twice as much work for you. Even if one is, the UK regime is simpler, you've still got to comply with two different sets of rules in order to get in the first place. So actually, for businesses, there's often a case for predictable regulation, which is the same in both the UK and the EU and the EU. And also there's a real risk that the UK loses out in cases where there is divergence because the EU is a larger market. And therefore, again, if you have a medical device, where are you going to prioritize selling that device? It's the market of that is 20% of global healthcare spending, not 2%, i.e. the EU, not the UK. The other big challenge is where the UK looks to change regulations away from what the EU did. Business might also be resistant because it wants to maintain alignment with what the EU does so it can sell in to the EU. A good example would be divergence on GDPR, which is regulation of data and how data is shared, kind of privacy regulations. Again, there are lots of sort of critics of GDPR within government, but the problem for services in particular is if you diverge from the EU regulation, it makes it harder for British services companies to trade their data, move it across into the EU. So you impose new costs on British businesses. So again, there's an incentive to remain aligned. So the upshot of this is it's actually been quite hard to find areas where there's a clear and obvious benefit for the UK from divergence. And government has broadly taken two, I would say, more recent steps to try and perhaps accelerate things a little bit. And they're very contrasting steps, actually. One is the retained EU law bill, which lots of you, I'm sure, will know lots about. And that's basically saying, all right, well, we haven't actually changed very much so far. So what we're going to do is effectively say all law that we've inherited from the EU will expire at the end of 2023 unless ministers or officials actively choose to retain or reform it. So that's sort of a way of kicking Whitehall into gear, I guess you could say. But there are lots of practical difficulties that come with that. And I'm not going to rehearse those.
We're going to discuss that more at greater length, I think, Joel.
Yeah, and just very, very quickly, the other one, which is a far more kind of targeted and calculated way, is this project which Sir Patrick Vallance has started, which is a review of, I can't remember the exact terms, but effectively it's looking at developing highly technical areas of regulation which are kind of still to be completed, and looking at perhaps there is where the UK has more advantages because the regulation hasn't been created yet, and therefore there are fewer EU regulations to move away from. Potentially the UK as an individual country can regulate faster than a 27-member bloc. You can get a bit of first mover advantage in certain very specific contexts. It's not about wholesale moving away from the EU. It's about points of quite technical comparative advantage. And again, I imagine we might come on to that, but those are, broadly speaking, the two approaches which now occupy the government's mind.
So just one final point, Joel. In the divergence tracker, you talked about active divergence, where the UK government positively chooses to do something different. But you also have this category that we invented, maybe we didn't invent it, but we use, called passive divergence. Can you just tell people whether there's been a lot of passive divergence and what exactly you're talking about when you talk about passive divergence?
Yeah, so passive divergence is kind of the fact that the EU is also changing its regulation since we've left, and the UK, doesn't automatically align with that regulation, except in quite a lot of cases, Northern Ireland. And so there you have gaps emerging where the EU is moving forwards. The EU has been a more active regulator than the UK, I would say, since Brexit, and kind of big areas are currently what's going on in terms of support for green industries, the Net Zero Industry Act, which is a response to the US Inflation Reduction Act, also doing a lot to regulate big tech, and there are parallels with the UK's online safety bill, which is not quite so far down the line as at the moment, but I'm sure, again, we might come on to some of those themes in the course of the discussion.